And we have another storyteller coming up. This is Rabbi Noah Farkas, who is rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom, which is a conservative temple in the LA area. As was said before, he is the co-founder of the Seminary Leadership Project, and he is now a Join for Justice board member. One thing you should know about Rabbi Noah is that when he was a kid, he dreamed one day of working in Jim Henson's puppet workshop.
Good evening. We never clapped for David's story, so make sure that we clap for David's story. So I am going to speak tonight about a really important night in my life. It was the night I met the President of the United States. Right. And there were a few other people in this room who were there that night. So let me talk about that night. It was a really, really nice night. So I got the invitation through email. I later found out that I got the invitation through email because the White House didn't have its stuff together to get enough invitations out to everyone who they wanted to send invitations out, so I got an email instead. But nonetheless, I got the invitation to the annual Hanukkah party. And, of course, I'm thinking to myself, this is awesome. Because, you got to be somebody to go to the White House, right? You got to be somebody. And so I had 5 days to cancel a very busy rabbinic schedule, to book a very, very, very expensive flight to Washington, D.C., and an even more expensive night in a very expensive hotel near the White House. And I fly in, and we go to the White House, and we go in this long line, and Eliza was there, Phil was there, Terry was there, Carla was there. Were other people there that night? Or other people were there. So you remember you remember standing in front of that weird machine with a huge German Shepherd staring you down, and you're like, and the guy's like, clear, and you're like, all right, I made it. Right? And then you go down the hallway, and you hear the beautiful music, because Pismona choir is singing, and give you a glass of wine from a very well-dressed Marine, and you start drinking, and you get to start to schmooze with people. And I'm thinking, this is amazing, right? And you see just how gorgeous this place really is. I mean, there's gold leaf on everything, and the Christmas trees, each one had a theme, and then you go into each one of the rooms, and you can pick out the china that you would serve if you were president of the United States. I chose Truman because I like mid-century, because I'm from LA. So, right? And then I go into the library, and one of the things they don't tell you is that when you take a tour of the White House, everything's blocked off with velvet ropes. But when you're invited to a reception, nothing is blocked off with velvet ropes, so you can sit on that 17th century couch. You can put your wine glass on that 18th century inlaid table. You can take the books off the shelf in the library. So I found a Mark Twain and took it off the shelf. Right? It's very, very, very cool. And then we go upstairs. And within 15 minutes, it feels like every other Jewish gala I've ever been to in my life. There's a rabbi in the corner over there who I have to go talk to. There's the executive director of this thing over here I have to go talk to. There's the federation person I have to go talk to. Right? And so and you're eating and you're schmoozing, and there's music playing, and then you realize, wait a minute, I'm not actually just at another gala. I'm in the White House. Right? Because there's the clock Gorbachev gave Clinton at the end of the Cold War. Right? And then there's the painting of George Washington just above it, right? And then of course there's that posthumous painting of John Kennedy, the very, very famous one where he's sort of like that, right in the hallway. So you get this amazing flash that you're not just at a ballroom or a synagogue anymore, you're in the people's house. And it's really powerful because my parents were school teachers, and their friends are taxi cab drivers, and their parents were tie makers, and their boy is now in the White House about to meet the President of the United States, right? Only in America, right? And so we go into the central hallway, and there's a rope line, and we're all squished, and we're trying to exchange contact information with the people around us, because if you take a picture of the president, That's great. But you want the person next to you to take a picture of the president because then you'll be in the picture. And so you're like trying to meet someone from Cleveland who might be able to like email you a picture. And it's very hot. And we're standing with, there's like congressmen and Supreme Court justices. I mean, it's crazy, right? And the president comes out, and it's a rope line. So he starts working the rope line, he starts shaking hands. Right? I place myself directly behind his two young children because I know that if he comes to the kids, he's going to stop for a minute, and I can actually maybe say something to him. And so he's coming around, and sure enough, he stops, and he talks to the kids about what they're studying in school. And I'm thinking to myself, I got like 10 seconds to say something to the President of the United States. What am I going to tell him? What am I going to say to him? This is my moment, right? It's not the Warhol 15 minutes. I got 15 seconds tops, right? And as I was thinking about that, I sort of got this flashback of what happened earlier in the night. You see, earlier in the night, I was able to make a few phone calls, and through my connections with a local broad-based organization in LA, got connected to the national group, and they were organizing a fast on the National Mall. They had built a tent, and inside the tent were men, women who were fasting because of immigration law in this country. And the immigration laws, as many of you know, have torn families apart. And that despite Barack Obama wanting to push the DREAM Act forward and other things, he's had the highest level of incarceration and deportation amongst any modern president. And of course, think back to our story about being a Jew who doesn't come from this country, and thinking about how if the laws we had today, my great-grandparents would never made it into this country. And so we walk in, and in the tent, there's like three areas. There's the center part, which is built up where they have a press conference area and almost like a shrine. And if you remember, there's a shoe in the middle of that shrine. It's a shoe of a kid that they found in the desert from a kid who died trying to cross the desert. That's right in the middle. And they take us into the press area, and then they take us into the very back area where people were privately fasting. And they're tired, and it's hot. And completely unlike the White House, this canvas tent is full of weak and tired people who haven't been eating for days. And Carla was there with me, and we sat with this man named Eddie Carmona. And Eddie was the lead organizer for this fast and for this immigration work. And we exchanged stories. Turns out Eddie's from the Central Valley, California, which is only about an hour north from where I live. And he talked a lot about how families in his area were being torn apart by these deportations, and that they couldn't fight anymore. They couldn't just use their voices, they had to use their bodies. And I shared a little bit about our story and about why we fast as Jews on Yom Kippur, because we want to have contrition. And we actually want to have a shift on a day like Yom Kippur because we fast to change something within ourselves. So at the end of the fast, we can go into the year feeling clean and new. And we share these stories back and forth. And he taught me something really important. He says, we fast because we're trying to change the world. And I said, well, I think that's a little bit of what I'm going to bring with me into my next Yom Kippur, to bring that little sense of fasting to change the world. And then Carla and I leave the tent, and we trudge around the National Mall where it's really dark, and we're trying to find a cab to take us to the White House. And we finally get there, and we come out, and we see Elisa right there. We saw Terry. We go through the security line, and then I'm standing in front of the president. And so when I look at the president, I say, hey, I didn't say hey, I said, Mr. President. Yo. Barry, no. I said, Mr. President, we just came from the National Mall where these men and women are fasting, and they're really doing God's work, and I really hope that you listen to them and make a policy change. And he smiled, that big Barack Obama smile, and gave me a big thumbs up. And at first I was like, yeah, he got it. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. He didn't say anything. He didn't commit to anything. You know, maybe he didn't even hear me, and he was just like, yeah, guy. You know, as a rabbi, sometimes you say or do things because you don't know what your congregants are thinking. So you're just like, okay, you know? So I thought maybe that's what he was doing. And then I'm thinking to myself, well, let's say he did hear me. He's just totally evading. And I know that the Hanukkah party is not the time or place to necessarily lobby the President of the United States, with whom I have no relationship. But I had to say something. And I had to do something, so I used that moment to talk about Eddie. And I was thinking, okay, so he gives me a thumbs up, and maybe he's evading the answer to the question. And maybe it's because we don't have enough of a relationship, or we're not strong enough yet to really push him. Which means at the end of the night, there's work to do. And so as we left the White House and went back to the hotel, I couldn't fall asleep, up very late that night. And one of the things I kept thinking about was, it's really wonderful to be invited to the White House for a party. Any Jew in the world would of course say yes to that invitation if they could, especially one who comes from the background that I come from. But to go from that tent of fasting to that house of feasting, to go from the type of leadership that Eddie had to the type of leader that the president has, really made the night sacred for me, because I learned that leadership can come from status and the trappings of power, but leadership can also come from relationships, from the story, from Eddie's pulling himself up and getting a movement of people to come with him to Washington to fast. And that's the kind of work that I believe is the work that needs to be done to change how this country gets the business of the people done, is to build those relationships, to take those stories, and to shift just from status and power and the trappings of wealth to shifting to relationships and stories, to really change how we live our lives. And so when I think about what I'm going to do when I stand in front of 10,000 people on Yom Kippur and talk about fasting, I'm going to talk about Eddie. Because I think if we change a little bit inside yourselves, we can change the world. Thanks.